Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Standby for Adventure. This is John. We've got another topic today, and I'm sort of organizing things on the channel so that I'm starting with a lot of basics and building up to more complicated or more advanced things. And mostly that's so that if anybody is interested in getting into gaming, those are the first things that I've covered. And I think there's a lot of good information in this space that never gets talked about, at least not in places that everybody is able to access because it happens at the gaming table. What I want to talk about today, though, is not really starting out as a new gamer or GM, but a format, a style of gaming that I think is probably very much underutilized and is a lot of fun if it's done correctly. And it's round robin GMing. And by round robin, all I mean is that every player or any of the players at the table who have volunteered get a chance to run the game. And I'm going to kind of walk through what I and a group did at one point for a game many, many years ago. But it was awfully fun, and I would love to do it again if I could find a group of people who were all interested in doing it. But what we did is, and I'll walk through the steps here, we came up with a setting that allowed for almost any sort of story we wanted to tell. And then the initial concept was we were going to have one player be the GM for a single week or a single session, and then wherever that story ended on that game night, that's where the next GM would need to pick up the game. And it was, like I said, originally conceived of as that, and I think that's still a really cool and interesting way to do a game like this. But I'll also give some other options here. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I've got a couple of different pointers here on how to build a game like this if you are interested in doing it. The first one is what's showing right here on the screen, which is in your session 0, when you sit down and pitch this idea to everybody at your table, and maybe you've all talked about, oh, I'm curious about GMing, but I don't have time to commit to a full-time game, or I've never done it before, so I'm really nervous. I just want to kind of dip my feet in and see what it's like. This allows for that, and this allows for a really kind of a low pressure way for everybody at the table to be able to get some experience GMing, hopefully with friends of yours, so people that you're comfortable with, so it's not going to be quite as intimidating as if you were just coming in fresh with players you don't know. But I think this is a fantastic way to run a game, and especially for new players, because one person is not in charge all the time. They're not responsible for everything that gets created in the game world and the stories and everything. And it also sets up this really interesting dynamic of having to sort of improv off of what, or storytelling off of what the other players have created before you. Maybe your session that you run ends with all the players stuck in jail, and that's where the next GM has to pick up the game from. There's all sorts of interesting things that can go on. And, sorry, my cat is completely in my way, sitting on my mouse pad, of course. But I think it's a really cool concept for a way of running a game, especially for new players. When you sit down in your first session, you're going to create the world. And you can use a pre-made world. You could use, depending on what setting you're in. If you're in Pathfinder, you could use Galarian. You could use a specific country in that setting. You would want to, obviously. You could use Waterdeep, and you could use the Forgotten Realms, you could use Eberron, you could use whatever. Maybe you're playing Deadlands, and you decide you're going to be based out of somewhere in Colorado, or something like that. Like, you can do anything in any world. When we created our game, we decided to do something sort of like Sinisher from the Grimjack comics, which is sort of an extra-dimensional city that pulls from all these different dimensions, and they sort of cross over at this one place called Sinisher. And so people could come from anywhere, and that's kind of the idea we had. It ended up morphing into more of like a battle world sort of plane, uh, sort of from Secret Wars, Marvel's Secret Wars comics, where there were chunks of other worlds that just were crammed together on this plane, and so you could go from the mountains to the desert in 20 steps, because these two biomes, or these two sections of the world, just happened to be next to each other, and they all followed their own rules. So it was really kind of fun, and so big sections of cities would appear and disappear, and things would change, and the landscape would change. But that's what you want to do when you sit down to create the world, is figure out what do you want the setting to be, and you can come up with anything you want. It just depends on what game you're playing, what game system you're playing, as to what sorts of things you'll end up doing and the characters you'll have. But in D&D you could, or D&D or Pathfinder or any fantasy game, you could just come up with exactly the thing we did and have a world where everything is just sort of jammed together, and you can play anything that would be appropriate to a fantasy game. It's really, really fun, and coming up with that whole concept for the world is also a really good time. You also want to determine in that first setting, is there anything about the world that is not changeable? Is there something that is just sacrosanct, you cannot alter it? Maybe there's a huge gemstone in the center of this world that you've created, and everything else is built around that, and that gemstone can't ever disappear because it's the thing that brings all this stuff together. And if the gemstone disappears, the world disappears. Maybe there's a king or queen or some type of rulership that is happening, and for whatever reason that can't change either. Maybe they're the people behind making this world the way it is, and if they go away, the world goes away. So are there things that can't change? And it could be even smaller things. It could be like, okay, please don't burn down our base of operations in your game. Whether that's a bar or somebody's house or a castle or whatever. Just that could be something that, like, please just don't ruin that, because that's sort of the place we all go back to and have as a safe place. So discuss that. What is it that can't change? Maybe there's no magic in your setting. Maybe there's no who knows? It could be anything. You could come up with any number of different things that you just want to make sure to spell out what can change and what can't change. Though, and I mentioned this earlier, one of the great things about running a game like this, hey, look, that's me in the picture. This was actually a few years ago at OrcaCon here in the Seattle area. Rob Schwalb was running a Shadow of the Demon Lord game. This was a good number of years ago, probably 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. The cool thing is, with this, is if you have a table full of people, everybody gets to play and everybody gets to GM, and nobody is taking so much time out of their schedule every single week to organize everything and make sure everybody has something that they're going to do in the game. It's all the stuff that a GM normally has to worry about every time they're going to run a game. But in this case, if you have 5 players at the table, you only have to do that once every 5 weeks at a minimum. Or minimum? Yeah, maximum? Minimum. Yeah, minimum. And maybe it'll be even longer because people who are the GM decide that they want to complete the storyline that they're telling, or again, that depends on how you want to set up the game. But it's really great because it's a pretty low pressure, low impact way to get everybody at the table, to give everybody at the table a chance to practice GMing and practice finding ways to become a better GM and get more comfortable with being the one who's in charge of, a lot of the stuff at the table. It's super, super useful. And, we use this back in the day when I was playing this game to let some new players who had been playing for a long time. They had just joined our group, but they had been playing for a long time and had never had the opportunity to run a game themselves and or hadn't taken that leap themselves. But this then allowed them to do that in a way that they were much more comfortable with. And if it ended up flubbing, it was only one night or maybe one section of that night that didn't go well. And people are generally pretty supportive of their friends when you're sitting around a game table and trying to have fun. So, and you get to rely on the other players, and also the other players are the GMs, so they can answer questions for people if things come up and you don't know the answer. It's really super, super great fun and really should be a very comfortable way of getting into GMing. I hope people give it a shot. If, however, somebody does not want to participate as a GM, don't make them. Maybe they'll get more comfortable with it when they see some people at the table who haven't run before actually do a good job running a game. Or even if it's not a good job, maybe they'll say, oh, that wasn't as good as the way X does it, but it was still fun and we had a really good time, and pretty much you always do unless things go horribly wrong. But it's really nice to be able to set up an environment so that people who might have some social anxiety, even amongst their friends, or don't think they're creative enough, or don't, whatever their reason, quote unquote, is for not GMing, this removes a lot of those barriers, and a round robin GM game does, removes a lot of those barriers. And also, since they're playing in the game, they do get to see what everyone else is doing, and it might get them more comfortable with the concept. And so if they then come forward at some point and say, hey, listen, I actually have an idea for something, fantastic, then let them try it. It's really, really a great way to get people comfortable with GMing. But like I said, don't force everybody. You don't sit down at the table and say, okay, everybody has to do this. If you can get buy-in from half or more of the players at the table, I think that would be plenty. And I will bet you almost all of the other players will eventually step up and say, I want to try. I'll give it a shot. And that's fantastic. Another important thing to determine, and this can be determined from GM to GM or storyline to storyline, is how long does each GM actually run the game? As I said in the beginning, we had originally conceived of our round robin game as being one session I would run, and wherever that ended, that's where the next GM would pick up. And it quickly morphed to become, I have an idea for a story that I want to tell in toto, and I'm just going to run it all the way through. And maybe it'll take 2-3 sessions, maybe it'll take 10 sessions. It was never 10 sessions. But, a handful of sessions to be able to tell this entire story of, who knows, maybe it's some type of dungeon crawl, or you're at a ball for 2 sessions, and there's all sorts of political intrigue stuff going on, and you want to be the GM for that because you know what is going to go on and what your eventual goal is in the story. So just have that as a discussion, and it could alter depending on, game to game and session to session, GM to GM. But it's definitely something you should talk about with everybody at the table. Like, how do we want to do this? How long are people going to be running this particular campaign, like from session to session? It's just an easy conversation to have. And this here, by the way, is a lunar calendar, in case anybody did not pick up on that. I just thought it looked really neat. Don't limit creativity. So when you're coming up with your world, don't, and this usually isn't a problem in gaming in general. It's very creative. People are, usually pretty free to come up with anything they want and introduce it to the game. And you should certainly maintain it with this, because you may have the ability to, or you may have the desire, or one of the GMs may have the desire to really do some crazy weird stuff. And I used the pictures of Modrons here because Modrons are perhaps one of the weirdest sorts of creatures in D&D, that are all based on geometric shapes and things like that. It's always been a really weird race, monster, creature, thing in the D&D setting that I've always thought is really goofy, but that's fine. Don't limit the creativity. Let people come up with whatever they want to, as long as, everybody seems to think it fits within the fantasy genre that you're working in. And you don't want to set up a world where this everything in this world has to be dark and grim, or everything in this world has to be light and happy, because that just absolutely limits too much of your storytelling. And you want to be able to have as much room to explore as possible, because it's not just you as the GM who's coming up with stuff. It's you and that player 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 coming up with stuff. And so you want to leave probably even more room than usual for weird stuff coming in, or strange storylines, things like that. So just don't, in your initial design of how the world or campaign setup is, don't limit things too much, because it's not just limiting you, it's limiting everybody else at the table in ways that you may not be conscious of. Allow for goofiness and inconsistencies. This is always true in D&D, but even more so in a round robin game where you have multiple GMs remembering, introducing, misremembering, reintroducing characters, storylines, plots, items, names. There's a ton of information that there's bound to be some crossed wires that end up happening. And you also have GMs that have very different styles of storytelling. So you may have a player at the table, and who knows, it could be a younger kid, it could be somebody older who just likes comedic games, who decides to do something really kind of goofy and out of left field, maybe bases an adventure on a Rick and Morty episode or something like that, right? Like just something goofy and weird and crazy, and it's still fun because you're still sitting around a table playing with your friends, but it's not what you would normally experience in a game that was run by a single GM who has a single point of view. And I think this is actually a really cool strength of round robin GMing, or round robin game, is that it does allow for any sort of story. And so you never know what you're going to get when you sit down at the table when a new GM shows up, until they've sort of established a track record of like, okay, this is going to be kind of a lighter game, or this is going to be probably a more serious game, or this is going to be a political game, this is going to be a thiefy game, this is going to be whatever. So just allow for that. Be open to just letting people be goofy if somebody wants to come to the table and GM a silly game. It can be a lot of fun. The image I chose for this is from Skull Kickers, which is a fantastically fun and funny comic book, very D&D, and in fact, they just released, if I can find it here, is this it? This is it. They just released actually a pretty excellent adventure book and setting that I would totally recommend, and it's based in sort of a school for wizards kind of setting, and it could be a really good option for a round robin GMing style too, although they do actually have a pre-written adventure and everything in that book that you would be running through from 1st to 10th level. I do recommend checking out the comic at the very least, and certainly the D&D book for it, because they're both very good. And they're very goofy and fun. Lastly, have a note taker, or have multiple note takers. Make sure that people are recording things that are going on so that you all have notes to refer back to because if you're a GM anything like me, you will often come up with things that you just come up with in the spur of the moment and forget to write down, or and this is true in any D&D game, but in a round robin game, you may not be at the table or you may not be the GM when somebody else is the GM, and they might need to find information from one of the other GM sessions that they just don't have normally. So be very good about taking notes, even more so than in a regular D&D game or D&D campaign, because you'll want to sort of as accurately as possible, keep a record of what the setting is and the sorts of things that have been introduced and what's there, what's not there. And it's going to be super useful for everybody to have someone who's good at taking notes to do that. I'd also absolutely recommend keeping track of that online in some way, whether it's something like even just a wiki or a website or Google Documents, anything like that that you can all kind of access and enter information to. I know there's also plenty of other campaign tracking software and websites out there that you can get to keep notes on all this stuff too. But notes, very, very important. And that's it for today. That is everything. So I'll run through these again quickly as I always do. So sit down, session 1, create the world together. Determine if anything is unchangeable, that no GM should alter it in any way. Know that everybody at the table will get to play and GM, so it's not as much of a weight on one person. If somebody doesn't feel like, or if multiple people don't feel like GMing, don't force them. They don't have to participate. You should still let them game with you, because like I said, they will very likely eventually decide, I'll give it a shot. And that's a very good thing. That's just fantastic, because it means they're getting more comfortable with the whole idea of it, which is fantastic. Determine how long each GM is going to be running the game and in control. Don't limit the creativity when you come up with the setting. Allow for anything, including goofiness and inconsistencies, that people may forget the names of things, and then try to head that off if you can by taking lots of notes. So there you go. I hope you like that one. I hope you give this a shot. Do let me know if you give this a try, because we had a lot of fun. This was a game that ran for years and years. With I think we had 5 or 6 different players at the table, and every single one of us at one point or another over the course of that campaign ran multiple sessions, and it was a lot of fun, and it's not something I see very often. The first time I encountered it was actually at a convention years and years ago. I'm sure it was back in the 80s, and even then it was super crazy. Like, they did really wacky stuff that I would not necessarily recommend, where we were in a D&D setting and we were fighting something in a tower, and then all of a sudden the new GM took over and a movie director yelled cut, and it turned out we were actually on a movie scene, or in a movie studio, and we had to go outside, and then a new GM took over and Cthulhu was there. Like, it was crazy. I don't recommend going that crazy. That's not the sort of thing I'm talking about. I'm saying run a pretty standard campaign. Just have new GMs every session or couple of sessions. Yeah, let me know. I hope you like this one. I tried to keep it really short. I know I've had some really long videos in the past, and I want to try and do more shorter ones. So have yourself a good day, and stand by for adventure.